3 children abandoned their mother while she was alive. When she died, the truth she left behind changed everything. They say grief is loud, that it crashes into your life like thunder, that it arrives screaming. But for Margaret Holloway, grief came quietly. It slipped into the house after the funeral closed the door behind itself, and stayed. The day after Thomas Holloway was buried, Margaret woke up before dawn, not because she needed to, but because for 36 years she had woken up beside him. Her body did not yet understand that he was gone. She lay still for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening for the sound that had always followed her waking, the soft clearing of his throat, the rustle of newspaper pages, the familiar sigh as he sat up on the edge of the bed. There was nothing, just the ticking of the clock on the wall. Margaret eventually sat up, folded the blanket carefully, and made the bed the way she always had. Thomas had liked the corners tight. Hospital neat, he used to joke. She paused when she reached his side of the mattress. For a moment, just a moment, her hand hovered there, then she smoothed the sheet anyway. Habit was stronger than heartbreak. Downstairs, the house smelled wrong, too clean, too empty. Yesterday it had been full of people, voices, condolences. Food brought by neighbors who meant well, but did not know what to say. Now, the refrigerator hummed quietly. The floorboards creaked under her feet, like they were surprised to feel her weight alone. Margaret made 1 cup of coffee, only one. She caught herself reaching for a second mug, stopped, and placed it back in the cabinet. She stood at the kitchen counter and drank slowly, staring at the window at the backyard maple tree Thomas had planted decades earlier. "It is just a tree," he had said back then, dirt on his hands, smiling at her. "But if we take care of it, it will outlive us." The leaves rustled in the morning breeze. Margaret swallowed hard. The children were supposed to come that Sunday, all 3 of them. Daniel had said he would. Clara had said she would try. Ruth had said she would let them know. Margaret had nodded, thanked them, and told herself not to expect too much. Still, she cleaned. She always cleaned. The dining table was wiped down twice. The guest bathroom was scrubbed until it smelled faintly of lavender. She vacuumed even the rooms no one would enter. By mid-afternoon she began cooking. She chose Thomas's favorite meal without thinking. Beef stew, slow-cooked, the kind that took hours and patience and attention. The kind she used to make when the children were young and came home hungry. As the pot simmered, the familiar rhythm of chopping and stirring steadied her breathing. Cooking had always been her way of loving out loud. At 4:30 she set the table, 4 places. She hesitated, and set 3 more, just in case. 6 o'clock came, then 6:30. Margaret wiped her hands on a towel and checked her phone. No messages. She told herself they were on the way. Traffic maybe. The children had their own lives now. At 7, she turned the stove down to keep the food warm. At 7:30, she sat at the table. At 8, the stew had cooled. Margaret stared at the empty chairs. She did not cry, not yet. At 8:15, her phone buzzed. Her heart lifted just slightly. It was a text from Daniel. "Sorry, Mom. Something came up. We will make it up to you." She read it twice, then a third time. Something came up. Margaret placed the phone face down on the table and folded her hands in her lap. The house was silent again. She stood slowly, carried the food back to the kitchen, and packed it away in containers, each one labeled neatly, as if order could somehow preserve dignity. She washed the dishes. She dried them. She turned off the lights. Upstairs, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at Thomas's empty pillow. "I tried," she whispered. "I tried. I really tried." There was no answer. That was the first time. It would not be the last. If this story already feels familiar, stay with me. Some silences speak louder than words. Let us continue. Margaret Holloway did not know it then. But that night marked the beginning of something far more devastating than grief. It was the night she began to disappear while still very much alive, and no one noticed. Abandonment does not always come with slammed doors. Sometimes it arrives gently, wrapped in politeness, hidden inside unfinished sentences. And that's what made it unbearable. After the first missed Sunday, Margaret Holloway did not confront anyone. She told herself it had been a fluke. People were busy. Life changed after death. Children grew up. She had raised them to be independent. She reminded herself of that often, as if independence explained absence. 2 weeks passed before she called Daniel again. She waited deliberately. She did not want her voice to carry longing. She had learned, over time, to soften her needs before speaking to them. "Hi, Mom," Daniel said. His voice was familiar, distracted. She could hear typing in the background. "I was thinking of making soup next Saturday," she said carefully. "Just something light. If you are free." There was a pause. Brief. Calculated. "Yeah," Daniel said. "That should work." Margaret reached for the small calendar by the refrigerator and circled the date. She did not decorate the circle. She had learned better than that. Saturday arrived quietly. Margaret cleaned, but not obsessively, just enough to feel prepared. She washed the vegetables, chopped them evenly, and set the pot on the stove. She did not set the table yet. At noon, she checked her phone. Nothing. At 1 o'clock, the soup simmered gently. The smell filled the kitchen, warm and familiar. At 1:30, her phone rang. She answered immediately. "Mom?" Daniel said, already apologetic. "I got pulled into something unexpected. I am really sorry." Margaret stared at the pot. "I understand," she said. They hung up. She ladled soup into a bowl and ate standing at the counter. She did not sit down. Clara was different. Clara always sounded enthusiastic. "Oh, I would love to come," Clara said when Margaret called. "Let me check with my husband. But yes, absolutely." Margaret thanked her and hung up. She did not write the date down. She waited. Days passed. No confirmation came. Margaret told herself not to assume. She kept the house in its usual order. She did not cook anything special. She did not set the table. But that afternoon, late, quiet, she found herself in the kitchen anyway. She mixed dough slowly, deliberately, telling herself she was baking for the freezer, that it was practical, that it meant nothing. The cookies smelled like Clara's childhood. Margaret placed them on a rack to cool and sat at the table, hands folded, eyes on the clock. 3 o'clock passed. 4, 5. Her phone remained still. No cancellation. No apology. No explanation. Just silence. Margaret wrapped the cookies carefully and slid them into the freezer. She did not cry. She did not call. She learned something important that day. Silence could be a decision. Ruth was the hardest to accept. Ruth had always been the sensitive one, the child who cried easily, the one Margaret thought would never drift far. Ruth was married now. She had 2 young children. Busy hands, busy days. When Margaret called, Ruth sounded tired but warm. "We will come soon, Mom," Ruth said. "I promise. The kids are just a lot right now." Margaret smiled even though Ruth could not see her. "I understand," she said. And she meant it. Weeks passed. Then months. Margaret stopped asking for dates. She learned phrase invitations vaguely. "Whenever you are free." When things settled down, they always agreed. They never came. The holidays were the worst. Thanksgiving arrived with its familiar heaviness. Margaret cooked anyway, less than before, but still enough for more than one person. She told herself leftovers would last. Christmas followed. Margaret decorated lightly, just a small tree. No ornaments that carried memories too sharp to touch. She placed 3 cards on the mantel. Daniel, Clara, Ruth. She mailed them early. No one came. The weddings happened quietly. Daniel married first. Margaret learned about it when the former colleague congratulated her in the grocery store. "Must be so proud," the woman said. Margaret smiled. "Yes," she said. She went home and stood in the hallway where family photos should have been. Claire married not long after. Margaret saw the photos online late one night. Clara, white, radiant, surrounded by people who had shown up. Margaret studied the background. She wondered who had helped her get ready. Ruth married last. Margaret found out months later. No call, no explanation. The grandchildren arrived without her. Birth announcements passed her by. First steps, first birthdays. Once, Margaret stood in a store holding a small stuffed rabbit. She imagined a child's hands gripping the soft ears. She put it back. Loneliness did not feel dramatic. It felt exhausting. Margaret began skipping meals, then forgetting them altogether. She slept lightly, waking often to the sound of nothing. Neighbors asked about her children. "They are busy," she said kindly. She never said they were gone. One afternoon she dialed Daniel's number and let it ring. Voicemail. She tried Clara. Voicemail. She tried Ruth. The call connected, then dropped. Margaret stared at the phone. And for the first time, she allowed the thought to fully form. They are not coming back. Not in the way she needed. Not in the way she deserved. She did not feel anger. She felt clarity. Margaret Holloway did not confront her children. She did not plead. She did not chase people who had already decided she was optional. Instead, something else began to take shape. Something quiet. Something deliberate. Something irreversible. There are moments in life that quietly divide everything into before and after. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand tension. They simply arrive and leave nothing the same. For Margaret Holloway, that moment came in a hospital room, with a door that never opened. The morning Margaret collapsed, the house did not react. It waited. The kettle sat untouched on the stove. Mail arrested, unopened by the door. The clock ticked on, steady and unconcerned. Margaret remembered reaching for the counter, then the floor. Then nothing at all. She woke to light that felt too bright, pressing against her closed eyes. The air smelt sharp and sterile. Her mouth was dry. Her limbs felt heavy, distant, as though they belonged to someone else. A machine beeped nearby, slow, rhythmic. She turned her head slightly. White walls, curtains, a narrow bed, a hospital. Fear flickered briefly and settled. She was too exhausted to panic. A nurse appeared, not long after. Calm voice, gentle hands. "Mrs. Holloway," she said, "you are safe. You collapsed at home." A neighbor heard the fall and called for help. Margaret nodded faintly. "How long?" she asked. "A few hours," the nurse replied. Margaret closed her eyes. Someone else had noticed. Dr. Samuel Ortega came later that afternoon. He was direct, composed, the kind of doctor who respected clarity. "You are dehydrated," he said. "You have lost weight. You are exhausted." Margaret stared at the ceiling. "I eat," she said quietly. Dr. Ortega did not contradict her. "We will keep you here for observation," he said. "A few days at least." Margaret nodded. Then she asked the question she had been holding back. "My children," she said. "Have they been notified?" "Yes," Dr. Ortega replied gently. "All three. I spoke with them personally." Relief rose in her chest, small, cautious, familiar. The first 2 days passed quietly. Nurses checked vitals. IV fluids dripped steadily. Meals arrived on trays, Margaret barely touched. On the second day, a nurse asked casually, "Are you expecting anyone today?" "Yes," Margaret said. "My children." The nurse smiled. "That is nice." Margaret watched the door more closely after that. By the third day, another nurse said, "Let us know if you are expecting visitors." Margaret nodded. She waited. On the fourth day, no one asked anymore. They adjusted instead. A different tone. A different rhythm. The nurses were still kind, still attentive, but the expectation, the assumption someone would come, quietly disappeared. Margaret noticed. She noticed everything. Dr. Ortega stopped by again. "They all said they would come," he said, almost apologetically. Margaret smiled faintly. "They usually do," she replied. Days stretched longer than they should have. Margaret watched other patients receive flowers. Visitors crowded rooms, talking too loudly, staying too long. She heard laughter echo down the hallways, arguments whispered behind curtains. Love arrived imperfectly everywhere. It did not arrive for her. By the 10th day, Margaret stopped turning her head when footsteps passed. By the 12th, she stopped wondering. By the 16th, her body was stronger, but something else had settled into place. Clarity. On the 17th morning, Margaret asked Seed, Dr. Ortega, I would like to go home, she said calmly. He hesitated. Medically, I would prefer you stay another day or two. I will not, she replied. He studied her face carefully. This was not defiance. It was decision. I will have discharge papers prepared, he said. That evening, a hospital volunteer wheeled Margaret through the corridors toward the exit. They passed rooms filled with voices, flowers, waiting families. Margaret said nothing. Outside, the air was sharp and real. A car waited, quietly arranged by Victor's office earlier that day. Margaret thanked the volunteer and stepped inside without looking back. No calls were made. No one was informed. When she returned home, the house felt different, not emptier, honest. She placed her bag by the door, sat at the kitchen table, and did not turn on the lights. She sat there through the night, thinking, not grieving, deciding. At dawn, Margaret rose, showered, dressed neatly, and ate a small breakfast. Then she picked up the phone. Victor Hale answered on the second ring. Mrs. Holloway, he said, it has been a long time. Yes, Margaret replied. It has. There was a pause. How can I help you? Margaret looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had waited for years. I want to take a closer look at everything Thomas and I built, she said. All of it. Victor understood immediately. The properties, he asked. Yes, Margaret said. And what they could become. Another pause. This one respectful. I will come by today, Victor said. When Victor arrived, Margaret was ready. They sat across from each other at the table. You and Thomas were careful, Victor said, reviewing old documents. Quiet. Strategic. Yes, Margaret replied. You want to expand, he said, not a question. I want to finish what we started, she corrected. Victor closed the folder slowly. You will need discretion, he said. Margaret met his eyes. I prefer it. Victor nodded. Then, let us proceed. Margaret Holloway did not seek revenge. She did not seek acknowledgement. She sought control over her remaining years. And for the first time since her children began drifting away, she was no longer waiting for anyone to arrive. Power does not always arrive with applause. Sometimes it moves in silence, keeps its head down, and grows strong and no one is looking. That was how Margaret Holloway chose to build. Victor Hale returned 3 days later with a thick folder and a thinner smile. You and Thomas were more prepared than you realized, he said, spreading documents across the kitchen table. You owned outright interests in 6 properties, quiet ones, no public association. Margaret studied the papers carefully. She recognized every address. They had bought the first one together on a whim, an aging duplex that needed work, sat on good land. Thomas had been excited, then nervous, careful. Margaret had been practical. Now she felt neither nostalgia nor grief, only focus. I want everything evaluated, she said, not for what it is worth now, but for what it could become. Victor nodded. That changes the scope. That is the point, Margaret replied. Within weeks, Victor assembled a small, disciplined circle. People who understood discretion. People who asked questions only when necessary. First was Naomi Brooks. Naomi had once managed portfolios that made headlines, then walked away when she realized visibility attracted the wrong kind of attention. She met Margaret in person only once before agreeing to work with her. Naomi listened more than she spoke. You do not want fast growth, Naomi said eventually. You want quiet expansion. Yes, Margaret replied. And you do not want your name attached to anything, Naomi continued. I want the work to speak, Margaret said. Not me, Naomi smiled once. Briefly, I can work with that. Next came Elijah Carter, a former operations director, who believed systems mattered more than personalities. He walked properties in silence, took notes, asked direct questions. These can scale, he said after reviewing the holdings, but you will need discipline. No emotional decisions. Margaret nodded. I have already had my share of emotional decisions, she said. Elijah did not ask what she meant. Helen Moore joined last, an accountant trusted by families who never appeared in magazines. Helen reviewed Margaret's finances, her retirement accounts, her existing income streams, and looked up slowly. "You have been living far below your means," Helen said. "Yes," Margaret replied. "You could have been comfortable for the rest of your life already," Helen added. Margaret folded her hands. "I want more than comfort," she said. Helen understood. The strategy was precise. They expanded through layered ownership structures. Acquisitions were staggered. Renovations were phased. Revenue was reinvested immediately. Margaret approved every major decision, not emotionally, logically. She did not rush. She did not boast. She did not tell anyone outside the circle. Her house remained the same. Her car aged quietly. Her routines never changed. Years passed. Then more years. Properties multiplied. Warehouses appeared in logistics corridors. Apartment complexes rose where neglected land once stood. Housing developments quietly transformed communities. Margaret never attended ribbon cuttings. She never posed for photographs. She sat at her kitchen table reviewing reports, asking precise questions, signing documents with steady hands. Her name did not appear. Her influence did. Her children noticed nothing. Daniel assumed his mother lived on a modest pension. Clara believed Margaret had simple needs. Ruth told her children their grandmother lived far away. Margaret did not correct them. She watched. When Daniel's student loan statements stopped arriving, he barely paused. "Must have finally paid them off," he told his wife. When Clara's credit card balances vanished, she assumed a clerical error. When Ruth's overdue notices disappeared, she thanked God quietly and moved on. None of them called Margaret. None of them asked how. Margaret authorized the payments personally. She did not leave a trail. She did not expect gratitude. This was not forgiveness. This was containment. Margaret also kept careful tabs on her grandchildren. She knew their schools, their schedules, their milestones. She attended none of them. She watched from a distance, never close enough to disrupt, never far enough to forget. She memorized faces, voices, gestures. She loved them quietly. By the time Margaret turned 70, her net worth, on paper, through layered holdings and trusts, had surpassed $200 million. She still lived in the same house, still shopped at the same stores, still answered the phone herself. Her children believed nothing had changed. They were wrong. One evening, as Margaret reviewed trust framework drafts with Helen, she paused. "I want the money protected," Margaret said. "From entitlement, from misuse." Helen nodded. "We can make it airtight." "And protected from their parents," Margaret added. Helen did not hesitate. "That can be done." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Then do it properly." Margaret Holloway was not building an empire for recognition. She was building it for control, for legacy, for a future that would not repeat the past. And she was doing it so quietly, and no one thought to look. Margaret Holloway never needed the world to know her name. She needed only to know that her life still mattered. And it did, quietly, profoundly, every single day. By the time Margaret turned 70, the empire she had built no longer required her constant attention. It ran on systems now, on discipline, on people who understood that silence was not weakness, but design. Her name did not appear on buildings. It did not appear in newspapers. It did not appear on plaques. And yet every decision still passed through her. Ownership without visibility, control without applause, exactly as she intended. Margaret's days settled into a rhythm that felt whole. She woke early, read the paper slowly, took long walks through neighborhoods she had quietly helped rebuild, areas once overlooked, now alive with families who would never know her face. She traveled, modestly but meaningfully. She visited historic towns, quiet coastal villages, places where she could sit unnoticed and simply be. No assistance, no entourage, no announcements. She was not hiding. She was living. If you believe dignity matters more than noise, let me know you are still listening. Now back to the story. Her generosity flowed the same way, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily year after year. Funds appeared anonymously at elder care centers that struggled to keep doors open. Housing initiatives received grants that changed entire communities. Answer research foundations found themselves suddenly solvent for another year. Checks arrived without names, only instructions, and gratitude, directed toward someone they would never meet. Margaret did not attend fundraisers. She did not pose for photos. She watched results instead. That was enough. But there was one project that mattered more than all the others. One that held Thomas's name in its bones, even if no one else knew it. Years earlier, Margaret had purchased a large parcel of land through a quiet holding company. The area had once been neglected, forgotten by developers who saw no profit in patience. Margaret saw something else. She worked closely with Elijah and Naomi on the design. Affordable housing, green spaces, community workshops, a place built not to impress but to endure. When construction was complete, the project was registered under a neutral foundation name. But in Margaret's private records, it was labeled simply Th. Project. Thomas Holloway, the man who had believed in slow growth, in honesty, in building things that outlasted ego. Margaret never visited the site with ceremony. She walked it once, alone. She placed her hand against the side of the first finished building and closed her eyes. "We finished it," she whispered. She did not need an audience. Her children remained unaware of everything. Daniel still assumed his mother lived quietly, perhaps frugally. Clara occasionally mentioned Margaret, passing. Always kindly, always distantly. Ruth told her children their grandmother lived far away and changed the subject. Margaret did not correct them. She stopped calling, not out of spite, out of acceptance. She sent birthday cards, holiday notes, brief messages that asked nothing in return. Sometimes she received a reply, often she did not. She learned to be at peace with that. Margaret was not lonely. That was the quiet irony. She was surrounded by people who respected her, by professionals who valued her mind, by communities that benefited from her presence, without ever knowing her name. She mentored young professionals quietly. She funded education discreetly. She watched lives improve because she chose to act. She laughed more than she had in years. She slept well. She lived fully. Silently, as her health began to slow her, not suddenly, not dramatically, Margaret turned her attention to preparation, not out of fear, out of responsibility. She met with Helen more frequently now. With Victor, with Naomi, they spoke of trusts, of protections, of permanence. Margaret was clear. "I want my grandchildren protected," she said, "not indulged." Helen nodded. "We can make it unbreakable." "Do it," Margaret replied. "And your children?" Victor asked carefully. Margaret paused, then answered evenly, "I will acknowledge them." That was all she said. Margaret Holloway did not live a small life. She lived a quiet one, and there is a difference. There are moments when preparation replaces hope, not because hope failed, but because clarity arrived. For Margaret Holloway, that moment came with pen and paper. Margaret sat at the same kitchen table she had waited at for years. The light was different now, softer. Afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the wood. Victor sat across from her, folder open. Helen Moore occupied the chair beside him, laptop closed, hands folded. Naomi joined remotely, her voice steady through the speaker. No one rushed. No one filled the silence. They understood what this moment required. "The trusts are ready," Helen said calmly. Margaret nodded once. "They will be substantial," Helen continued. "Individually structure for each grandchild." "And the conditions?" Margaret asked. Helen met her eyes. "Strict. Enforceable. No parental access. Ever." Margaret exhaled slowly. "Good." Naomi's voice came through the speaker. "Release is set at 25. Character requirements are built in. Employment verification. Educational completion. No criminal record." "And if they do not meet the standards?" Margaret asked. "The funds revert to the foundation," Naomi replied. "No exceptions." Margaret nodded again. She did not hesitate. Victor cleared his throat gently. And your children?" he asked carefully. The room grew still. Margaret did not look away. I will acknowledge them, she said evenly. Victor waited. Helen glanced down at her notes. It will be modest, Margaret added. No one reacted. Victor did not raise his eyebrows. He simply wrote it down. And letters? He asked. Yes, Margaret replied. Separate, personal. And video? Helen added. Margaret paused. Yes, she said. They should hear my voice. The will itself was exhaustive, not dramatic, not vengeful, just thorough. Properties were allocated to charities Margaret had supported quietly for decades: elder care centers, foster housing organizations, cancer research foundations, community development trusts. Each gift was structured carefully, protected from misuse, designed to endure. Her staff, every one of them, was remembered. Elijah was provided for fully. Helen's children were secured beyond uncertainty. Naomi received something rare: trust and gratitude made tangible. Victor Hale was named executor and left a private bequest, accompanied by a letter of acknowledgement. Margaret's instructions were simple. He understood me, she had written. And he protected what mattered. Even the home health care aide who checked on Margaret twice a week was included. Margaret insisted. She showed up, Margaret said simply. The Thomas Holloway project was addressed last. Victor reviewed the documentation slowly. This will transfer fully to the foundation upon your passing, he said. The dedication will be revealed then. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Good, she said. Let it speak for itself. Weeks passed. Margaret worked methodically. She wrote the letters by hand. One for Daniel, one for Clara, one for Ruth. She did not accuse. She did not beg. She wrote facts. Invitations sent. Calls unanswered. Hospital days spent alone. She described the choices they made and the consequences of those choices. She ended each letter the same way. I forgave you long before I stopped waiting. The video recordings were harder. Margaret dressed neatly, sat upright, looked directly into the camera. She spoke calmly. She named her love. She named her pain. She revealed her wealth, not to impress, but to explain. I lived fully, she said in one recording. I was not waiting in a dark room for you to return. Her voice never cracked. That was the most devastating part. When everything was finished, Victor closed the Flina folder. This is unassailable, he said. There is no room for challenge. Margaret nodded. That was the intention. She stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street. For years, she had waited for footsteps that never came. Now, nothing remained undone. Margaret Holloway did not seek revenge. She built truth so solid that it could not be argued with. There is a difference between what is hidden and what is ignored. Margaret Holloway did not hide the truth. She simply stopped explaining it to people who never asked. Long before the documents were signed, long before the letters were written, the signs had already been there. Subtle, consistent, waiting to be noticed. Daniel had always considered himself practical. He paid attention to numbers, at least the ones that mattered to him. That was why he noticed when his student loan statements stopped arriving. At first, he assumed it was an administrative delay, then the system error. Then, eventually, he stopped thinking about it altogether. The balance no longer showed up online. No bills, no warnings, no collection notices. Finally, he told his wife one evening, "Looks like that is done." She asked how. Daniel shrugged. Probably some consolidation thing. He never checked. Clara noticed something similar. Her credit card balances, ones she had quietly worried about late at night, were suddenly gone, zeroed out. She called the bank once. They confirmed the payments had been made in full. Who made them? She asked. The representative explained politely that the payments were valid and authorized. Clara thanked them and hung up. She told herself she would look into it later. She never did. Ruth experienced it differently. For her, relief arrived quietly. Overdue notices disappeared. Past due balances were cleared. The knot in her stomach loosened. She bowed her head one night and whispered prayer thanks. She did not ask who answered it. They all lived in comfortable homes, not extravagant, but stable. The rent was low, strangely low. Each year when leases renewed, the increase was negligible. Sometimes there was no increase at all. Must be a good landlord, Daniel said once. Clara agreed. We got lucky. Ruth nodded. In this market, definitely lucky. None of them asked who owned the properties. None of them asked why the rent never reflected rising costs. None of them questioned why maintenance requests were handled promptly, quietly, without pushback. The houses simply held. Margaret knew every address, every lease, every payment schedule. She reviewed them the same way she reviewed everything else, methodically, without sentiment. She did not interfere, she did not remind, she did not attach conditions. She believed that help offered without humiliation would still help. Victor had once asked her, carefully, "You realize they have never asked who owns those properties?" Margaret nodded. "That is not an accident," she replied. "The houses were held under separate entities, clean structures, unremarkable names, nothing that led back to her unless someone really wanted to know. And no one ever did. Margaret never visited those homes. She never crossed the threshold. She never stood in their kitchens or sat in their living rooms. She respected boundaries even when they were not extended to her. Her presence existed only in stability, in safety, in roofs that did not leak, in rents that did not rise. She watched from a distance as her children lived lives cushioned by protection they never acknowledged. She watched them complain about stress, about money, about how hard things were. She did not interrupt. She did not remind them of the hands that steadied the ground beneath their feet. One afternoon, Helen brought the summary reports. "Everything is current," she said. "No missed payments, no defaults." Margaret scanned the documents. "Good," she said. "And when the time comes," Helen asked quietly. Margaret closed the folder. "They will not be displaced suddenly," she said. "We will do it properly." Helen understood what that meant. Margaret did not consider this manipulation. She considered it responsibility. She had raised them to stand on their own. She had simply made sure the ground was solid while they learned. What they did with that security was their choice. The tragedy was not that Margaret gave quietly. The tragedy was that the giving became invisible because no one ever bothered to look closely. What would you leave behind if the people you loved never noticed you while you were alive? Comment below. Let us return to the story. The calls did not come dramatically. They came quietly, the way news does, when a life has already begun to fade from daily thought. Daniel received his while standing in the grocery store, phone pressed to his ear as the voice on the other end spoke with professional calm. "I am calling to inform you that Margaret Holloway passed away early this morning." Daniel stood still long enough for someone to clear their throat behind him. "I see," he said. "Thank you for letting me know." He ended the call, stared at the shelf in front of him, then placed the phone back in his pocket and finished his shopping. Clara's call came at her desk. She listened without interruption, posture straight, pen unmoving in her hand. "Yes," she said, when the voice paused. "I understand." She did not cry. She sent one email canceling her afternoon meetings, then sat quietly for several minutes, hands folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Ruth's call came at home. She sat down on the edge of the bed before the caller had finished speaking. When the line went silent, she remained there, staring at the wall, tears slipping down her face without sound. Her husband found her minutes later and sat beside her without asking questions. They spoke to each other later that day, briefly, practically. Arrangements, they assumed, would need to be made. They learned soon enough that there were none to make. Margaret had already done everything. The funeral took place 3 days later. All 3 children attended, each accompanied by their spouse. Daniel wore a dark suit that fit him well, his expression composed, his attention drifting toward logistical details rather than memory. Clara stood beside her husband in black, hands clasped tightly in front of her, face controlled to the point of strain. Ruth wore a simple dress, eyes red, grief closer to the surface and she would have preferred. They sat together. They did not speak much. The service was quiet, short. Precisely as Margaret had instructed. Music she had chosen herself. Readings she had approved. No flowers. In place of them, A small note printed on the program requested donations to elder care charities and cancer research. The children noticed. They did not comment. When it was over, condolences were exchanged politely. Chairs were folded. The room emptied. There was nothing left to plan. Only after the funeral, after grief had settled into something quieter, less performative, they asked to return. That was not an accident. It was instruction. Margaret Holloway did not want her will read, while emotion was loud and steady. She wanted her words heard when silence could no longer be avoided. So the will was read after she was laid to rest. After the flowers were cleared. After the chairs were stacked. After grief lost its audience. The conference room was larger than the children expected. Daniel arrived first with his wife beside him. Clara followed with her husband, posture rigid, eyes guarded. Ruth came last, her husband guiding her gently to a seat. They noticed the others immediately. People they did not recognize. A woman in a tailored suit. An older man with careful posture and a folder on his lap. Two professionals seated together, whispering softly. A woman none of them recognized sat quietly near the back, later introduced as Margaret's home healthcare aide. Daniel leaned toward Clara. "Why are all these people here?" Clara shook her head. Their mother had lived quietly, ordinarily, so why did this feel formal? Victor Hale stood once everyone was seated. He waited. "This reading," he began, "is being conducted pursuant to the explicit instructions of Margaret Holloway." He looked around the room. "Attendance today includes named beneficiaries, trustees, executors, and representatives of organizations referenced in the will." Daniel straightened. "Organizations?" Victor continued, voice steady. "Margaret Holloway executed this will while in full possession for mental faculties, possessing complete testamentary capacity, and acting freely, without coercion or undue influence." He turned a page. The will was properly signed, witnessed, notarized, and includes a self-proving affidavit, making it legally valid without the need for further testimony. Another pause, measured, deliberate. This will also contains a no-contest clause. Any attempt to challenge it, in whole or in part, will result in immediate forfeiture of any interest. No one spoke. Victor went on. "Mrs. Holloway also recorded video affirmation of this will, confirming its contents and her intent. The recording mirrors a written document and further establishes its enforceability. This had been planned carefully." Victor adjusted the papers. "Mrs. Holloway made full arrangements for her end of life." He read calmly. All funeral and burial expenses were prepaid. Music selections were chosen personally. She requested a simple service. No flowers. Donations were directed instead to elder care organizations and cancer research foundations. Ruth's breath caught. She planned everything. She whispered. Victor turned the page. Margaret Holloway leaves behind an extensive real estate portfolio held through private entities, trusts, and charitable foundations. Daniel's wife glanced at him sharply. Victor listed them without embellishment, including but not limited to apartment complexes, warehouses, residential developments, community housing initiatives. As directed, Victor continued, all such holdings have been donated to charities, foster housing organizations, elder care facilities, and medical research foundations. Clara's face drained of color. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. One project, Victor said, turning another page, requires special mention. The Thomas Holloway Project, a community housing and development initiative built quietly over decades in memory of Mrs. Holloway's late husband. Daniel's head snapped up. She built something for Dad? Yes, Victor said simply. And she never spoke of it publicly. Daniel's wife stared at him. You never told me your mother did anything like this, she whispered. Daniel had no answer. Victor paused. Before individual bequests are read, he said, Mrs. Holloway requested that a letter be read aloud. He lifted a sealed envelope. This letter is addressed to her 3 children. The room stilled. Victor broke the seal and began. My children, if this letter is being read, then I am no longer living among you. I want to say this clearly before anything else is heard. This letter is not written in anger. It is written in honesty. I am not speaking to wound you. I am speaking because silence has already done enough of that. I noticed many things over the years. I noticed when each of you married. I learned of those marriages after they had already taken place. I never met the people who became your husbands and wives. I never once crossed the threshold of your homes. Not because I was unwilling, but because I was never invited. I noticed when grandchildren were born. 5 lives entered the world carrying my blood, and yet I never held them. I never kissed their cheeks. I never rocked them to sleep, or spoiled them the way grandmothers dream of doing. There is a particular kind of grief in being alive and still absent. It is quieter than loss by death, but it lingers longer. I imagine small things I would never do, reading stories, baking treats, hearing laughter spill through rooms I was never allowed to enter. I did not imagine these things with entitlement. I imagined them with love. When those moments never came, I learned how to love differently, from a distance. I watched my grandchildren grow the only way I was permitted to, quietly. I know that Ethan Holloway observes before he speaks, listening longer than most. I know that Lily Morrison Holloway carries a steady kindness, and that Noah Morrison Holloway is endlessly curious. I know that Amelia Bennett Holloway feels deeply, and that Grace Bennett Holloway has a brightness that draws people toward her. These are not secrets. They are the kinds of things one can know when one pays attention without demanding access. Though I was never given the chance to hold them, I loved them fully. I protected their futures without asking them to know my name. I want you to know something else. Absence often invites assumptions. I lived fully. I traveled farther than you knew. I saw places I once only imagined, and I did it quietly, without announcements, because joy does not require an audience. I was not waiting in a dark room to be remembered. I also noticed that you always agreed to visit, yet never arrived, that you promised presence, yet practiced absence, that my phone rang less each year, even though I remained reachable. I am not angry about these things, but I noticed. Love does not require me to abandon myself. I forgave you long before I stopped waiting. If there is anything I wish you to carry forward, it is this. Pay attention to the people who love you quietly. Absence does not always arrive through cruelty. Sometimes it arrives through postponement, though later, I loved you all, and I noticed. Mother. Victor lowered the letter. No one spoke. In addition, Holloway directed that those who served her faithfully, consistently, and with care be remembered in her estate. A chair shifted softly. Someone exhaled and did not realize they had been holding their breath. Victor continued. Mrs. Holloway established trust funds for each of her grandchildren as follows. He read deliberately. To Ethan Holloway, the sum of $15 million. To Lily Morrison Holloway, the sum of $15 million. To Noah Morrison Holloway, the sum of $15 million. To Amelia Bennett Holloway, the sum of $15 million. To Grace Bennett Holloway, the sum of $15 million. To Grace Bennett Holloway, the sum of $15 million. Adlers, these trusts are inaccessible until the age of 25. They're protected by strict conditions and allow no parental access. Failure to meet the conditions results in forfeiture to charity. Victor turned the final page, and finally, to my son, Daniel Holloway, my firstborn, I bequeath the sum of $10. To my daughter, Clara Holloway, I bequeath the sum of $10. To my daughter, Ruth Holloway, I bequeath the sum of $10. Victor closed the folder. This will is final. It cannot be contested. Silence followed, long, complete. The room held its breath, a chair creaking softly somewhere behind them. Margaret Holloway did not raise her voice in life. She did not raise it in death. She let truth speak when no one could interrupt. Years passed, not loudly, not ceremonially, just steadily, marked by birthdays, graduations, ordinary seasons, stacking quietly on top of one another. Time moved quietly forward until the year Ethan Holloway turned 25. Ethan had grown into a man who thought before he spoke, who listened longer than most, who carried himself with a steadiness people noticed, without knowing why. He did not expect the letter. When it arrived, formal, unassuming, he assumed it was a mistake, until he read the name. Margaret Holloway, grandmother. The trust administrator spoke carefully. There are conditions, she said, and materials you must review before anything proceeds. Ethan nodded. He had always been good with conditions. He watched the recordings first. Margaret's voice filled the room, calm, measured, unmistakably alive. She spoke to him directly, not as an idea, not as a story, as someone who knew him. She spoke of watching him grow from a distance, of noticing his patience and how he treated people who could do nothing for him. I wanted you to have space to become yourself, she said, not to live under my name, but to carry it if you chose. Ethan sat very still. He read the documents next, slowly, the trust, the conditions, the safeguards, then the rest, the properties, the charities, the Thomas Holloway project. What he learned unsettled him, not because it was shocking, but because it was consistent. She had been there, everywhere, quietly. Ethan asked questions. He requested records. He did not rush. He visited the Thomas Holloway project one afternoon. He walked the grounds alone. Children played in a courtyard. An elderly couple sat on a bench, hands intertwined. There was no plaque with her name, only sunlight warming the concrete where children's laughter echoed nearby. No statue, just stability. He understood then. This was how she loved. Later, Ethan sat with his father. Daniel had aged. Regret had settled into him in quiet ways. She never said anything, Daniel said once, staring at the floor. Ethan answered gently. She said everything. Years later, Lily Morrison Holloway asked him once, "Do you think she would have liked me?" Ethan smiled. "She already did," he said. "She just never needed you to know." Ethan fulfilled every condition, not because of the money, because he recognized the trust for what it was, not inheritance, legacy. He funded education quietly, supported elder care, protected housing initiatives. He never used Margaret's name publicly. He did not need to. He knew where it came from. Some people leave money. Margaret Holloway left proof. That love does not need applause. That presence can exist without proximity. That silence does not mean absence. And that what is overlooked in life may one day become the clearest truth of all. Margaret Holloway did not ask to be remembered. She built something that made forgetting impossible. And in the end, what finally reached her was not regret, but understanding. This was not revenge. Revenge wants pain. Margaret Holloway wanted truth. She did not take anything from her children. She simply stopped protecting them from what they chose to ignore. She fed them when they were hungry, sheltered them when they were unsure, paid debts they never asked about. Loved grandchildren she was never allowed to touch, and when she was gone, she left them exactly what they had given her, absence. Some lessons arrive late, some regrets have no witnesses, and some love survives without permission. If this story made you think about someone you have overlooked, reach out while you still can. And if quiet love still matters to you, subscribe for more stories like this. Did you enjoy the story? Thank you for staying with me to the end. On the screen, you will see another life story that I highly recommend. See you in the next life story.